If you'll all recall, in a previous episode after installing the wheels and tires, we had a massive blowout due to one of the tires being like 10 years old. The car was already a rusty mess, but this tore up the metal and the bumper as well too. So, in an attempt to save this rusty, crusty mess, let's get out the power tools again.
Dale, no power tools!
And start to cut this thing up and fabricate some new parts. Join us as we cut metal, heat metal, cut some more metal, clean some metal, and hit the car with a hammer like a 5-year-old, pretending to know what we're doing. All this and more on today's episode of the Mazda Protege Safari5. We're going to start off here by trying to remove the rear bumper. This is unfortunately in the way of the metal that we need to repair, so we're going to go ahead and try to take this off. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling with these screws though, because guess what? Just like every other single thing on this car, it's rusted in place. So we're going to use some PB Blaster on those and come back to it later. You can see here that I'm starting to mark the areas that I'm going to cut out. You can see just how bad it is behind that fender. We're going to have our work cut out for us on this one. As I mentioned in previous episodes, these Protege 5s are really prone to rust, and anyone that knows a thing or two about these cars or has owned one will certainly understand that problem as well too. This is going to make for an interesting repair because it gets pretty close to the actual body line. Here I'm using what's called an impact screwdriver. This actually has a cam mechanism that allows you to hit the screwdriver with a hammer, and it rotates the screwdriver itself in an attempt to dislodge any kind of rusty bolts like this. In that instance, it still wasn't working, so what I'm doing is taking a grinder wheel and shaving these bolts all the way down so that I can just pull the plastic bumper through those holes. With the rear bumper finally removed, we can finally access all that really bad rust back here. Now, in a previous episode, I also mentioned that the spare tool area that goes into the trunk compartment actually has a massive hole, and you can see right up in there. So we're going to try to attempt and rebuild that section and close it off, because right now it's just open to the elements. If you're a car enthusiast and watch a lot of amateur builds, you'll understand the CAD process here. For the uninitiated, CAD is cardboard aided design. Of course, just a play on words here, but it is extremely helpful in trying to create and fabricate new pieces of metal. We're going to try to replicate the part here and mark the bend in it. And then we'll take it over to our welding table where we'll draw it onto the metal itself. And then cut it out with an angle grinder and bend it to shape. A little rough, but not too bad for my first piece. Just file down those edges and offer this up to the car and see how it looks. I believe this was 22 gauge sheet metal, so it's extremely thin. It's typical for bodywork, and it's so thin that you can just manipulate it with your hands, as I'm seeing here, and just trying to replicate that bend. Now, I must mention, of course, I am not a professional, and there are probably far better ways to do this, and it might even just be easier to cut out that entire section of metal there, but I'm trying to leave what structure I can. That way I have a real good template to follow and existing metal to work with. I'm sure it could have been easier done another way, but again, I am not a professional. I'm just trying to get in there and learn how to do this stuff, and this is the perfect car for it. Nothing on this needs to look that great anyways, since it's going to be hidden behind bumpers. These are sheet metal tin snips, and they're really great at cutting little pieces of thin gauge metal. And here we will grind back all the rust we can in an attempt to get it clean and ready for new metal. Unfortunately, my 7-year-old Harbor Freight angle grinder doesn't really feel up to the task. More on that later. So this is SEM copper weld, and this is a weld through primer that's zinc and copper based, and this is extremely good for rust prevention as well as being able to have a great surface to weld through. This stuff was extremely expensive, and I'm not joking when I say that was about a $50 can, so I'm using it pretty sparingly here. Looks like it needs just a little bit more curvature on the top side to match the OEM body line there. Now we'll use these welding magnets to hold it in place while we go ahead and tack it down with the welder. This is the first time I've got to use this welder. I bought it off a friend for a pretty good deal. It is a MigMax 140 Vulcan from Harbor Freight, and this is around the time when they first started improving their tools and starting to make more of a premium lineup, I would say. This is my first welder with an actual tank, so this is going to be a learning experience for me, as I've never welded with any type of gas setup. I've only ever used a flux core setup. I've only welded a handful of times in my life as well too, so get ready for some very poor and less than stellar welds. But again, this is all a learning process, and we're going to try to just power through it and learn what we can. I believe this black discoloration is from a lack of welding gas that is actually preventing contamination on these welds, and pretty rookie mistake. I think I thought I had gas in the tank and I really didn't. Although it could have been done easier in one big piece, I'm actually pretty proud of myself for making these little jigsaw puzzle cuts and welding these in place. Again, not professional, not concourse. Don't ever pull off my bumper and look at it. But it is gonna hold. It's very structural. How will you ever learn if you don't get out there and actually do it yourself? I don't know. And if you think you can do it better, I'm sure you probably could. Let me know and you can come over and do it for me. Again, far from perfect or professional, but I'm really happy that I did this myself. With my ADHD mind, it was time to move on to another section that was bothering me. This hole below the door needed to be addressed, as well as the inner fender liner you see here. Again, this is another really bad section. As well as external, there is internal rust as well, and this needs to be addressed. It goes up into the actual door sill, so we're going to cut that out and redo all this. Thankfully, that's going to be hidden by both the side skirt and the plastic door sill trim. Look at that magnificent pile of rust there. So, since there's plenty of internal rust, what we're going to go ahead and do is open this section up and use a rust converter to go ahead and convert all that rust into a neutralized base. We'll use a Rust-Oleum naval jelly and then rinse all of that out thoroughly with water and make sure that it's dried up before applying some of that SEM paint. Now I have another patch panel in place that we're going to attempt to weld in place here. Again, I know it's super ugly, but it is going to be hidden by a side skirt, so I'm not too worried about it. So as I mentioned earlier, I was having gas flow problems. It turned out actually that a lot of the issue came down to the regulator not functioning properly, so I ordered a new one, threw out the old one, and installed the new one. Then I also got a fresh new tank of 75-25 argon CO2 mix. I thought this style regulator was pretty cool. You just adjust the gas flow and then use the gun to meter out and Wherever the ball ends up floating at is your pressure. So I think we want to get this around to 25 psi if I recall. And then once the ball hovers at about that spot, you're good to go.
Alright, this might be a little hard to see on camera, but we are using .030 wire gauge for the welder. And the material is going to be 22 gauge, so what we're doing here is we're using mild steel that we're welding with, wire type solid wire. We're using 75-25 argon CO2. Polarity setting, it tells you DCEP. And then we find our wire size, .030, and come over to our gauge here. And it actually does not have a recommended setting for that. So the closest that we can get is it's going to be, well, I guess maybe this is covering all of these, is setting B for wire speed, and then 1.5 on the answer. By the way, I am no expert in this at all. So we're going to go to wire speed A, I think it was, no, I'm sorry, B, and then 1.5.
I was having some equipment failures, you could say. My welding helmet really wasn't working correctly and dimming right, and between that and getting dark, I just went ahead and called it for the night. In an attempt to come back stronger, I went to Harbor Freight and picked up some new materials here. Got a new grinder so we don't have to worry about that old faulty one, as well as some new tools and new wire. This new wire is going to be a really important bit. I was having a bit of issue with the .030 wire, as it was actually burning through the metal. Because of the thicker gauge of that wire, I had to run it at a higher voltage, meaning more heat, and it was burning through that thin gauge metal. So I found a .0023 wire at Harbor Freight, and we changed that out, and we're going to try to make this work now. I also ended up picking up a new welding helmet since this one really wasn't dimming properly, but that's going to show up sometime later. Since a lot of that inner arch metal was so torn up and so rusty, we're going to go ahead and cut off the bad edges and just start fresh here. Let's slice all that off and create some new pieces for that. Again, we're going to try to do some rust cleanup on the inside. We're going to go ahead and wire brush down all the loose rust that we can, clean that off, dry it out, apply the naval jelly, rinse all that out, dry it off again, and then we should be good to go. The last thing I'm going to do for now is attempt to stitch weld this panel back together with the inner and the outer skin. Again, this separates when we cut the fender for those fender flares, so we need to go ahead and stitch this up so that it's weatherproofed and water's not going to spray up in there and further rust this car out, more so than it is. With that done for the moment, let's move on to something different. More on this in a moment, but we're getting ready to take this car on quite a long trip. I want to make sure that all the fluids are good and up to par. We're going to use Valvoline's synthetic manual transmission fluid here, and in their new squeeze bottle form. This stuff is extremely helpful. No more fluid transfer pumps, which are always a pain, trying to fit under the car, and then I always knock over a bottle. So I really like this design. Not sponsored by Valvoline in any way, but I really enjoyed that product. The next thing is going to be this Exile Auto Works shifter bushing kit. Now, you'll see I'm going to have a problem with this, but again, comes down to rust. Maybe an alternative name for this episode could be something like, "You give me rust issues." I don't trust anymore. Again, extremely unfortunate, but I can't remove the bolt out of this front linkage setup. So, removing this small frame connector, I'm going to try to hammer this bolt out of place. Guess what? Nothing worked. Due to this, I was only able to get the one shifter bushing replaced underneath the shifter directly, and it did help.
Certainly feels better, however, I wish I could have replaced those other.
And of course my camera died there and I didn't realize, but it does feel better than it did, but hopefully sometime we'll get the rest of those bushings installed as well. For now, we are done. I know you're all going to find this very hard to believe, but that was a ton of work. Way more than it shows in a video edit. So unfortunately, I didn't finish that work. I got distracted with life stuff and it kind of fell to the side. Of course, the car still runs and drives and I've been using it all the time, but I really do wish that I'd finished that up. Again, bodywork is not the most important thing in the world though, and the car is extremely functional with tons of new pieces. With that being said, I think it's time that we take this thing on a little bit of a road trip to celebrate the end of this build. For now. And it is time to now set up our little hotel. I'll give you a little tour here, but got it all set up and wow, it is actually super cozy in here. So, what do we have here?
We've got a couple of 20-year-old Miatas.
It's weird to be walking on the roof of somewhere. And there's actually a bunch of gravestones back there that I passed that are part of a pet cemetery. Well, folks, we have made it officially to the East Coast. These pipes, man, they're rusty. They're almost as rusty as the Protege5. It's a pretty good view. But damn, I'm always tired.
Somewhat big problem here. It feels like there's maybe like a massive misfire going on here.